Have you ever tried Googling your full name with your city? Well, you'll probably find your address, your phone number, maybe even some old court records if you have them, just kind of sitting there for people to look at. Well, Incogni helps you wipe that stuff off of the internet. It sends opt-out requests to hundreds of data brokers automatically. Plus, now they've got a new unlimited plan, which means you can go even further. For example, you got a site exposing your personal info, just drop it into Incogni dashboard and their team will get to work to get it removed, even if it's not one of the 250 plus sites that they already support automatically. With Incogni, it's like having privacy experts on call scrubbing your name from places you didn't even know existed. You submit the link, they handle the rest. No arguments, no emails, no drama. So take your personal data back with Incogni. You can use the code SHADOWS at incogni.com/shadows and get 60% off an annual plan. And now today's video. On the morning of September the 11th, 1857, about 100 people crouched within the protective interior of an encircled wagon train. Men held guns, pointing them at the sagebrush, preparing for the next attack during what had become a 5-day siege. Many women and children anxiously waited with them. Only a few days earlier, they had been traveling peacefully through southern Utah as part of their journey from Arkansas to California on the Old Spanish Trail. Led by Alexander Fancher and John Baker, the group would become known to history as the Baker-Fancher Party. Unfortunately, this group, they'd never reach California. On the horizon, a man appeared, carrying a white flag. The excitement among the wagons must have been palpable, a sign their ordeal was nearly over and that help was on the way. Yet little did they know that white flag did not herald deliverance. It marked the beginning of their doom. By day's end, the entire wagon train would lie dead, their bodies unburied and scattered across the Utah desert. It would be years before these victims of domestic religious terrorism received even a measure of justice. This is the story of one of America's greatest forgotten acts of frontier violence, a crime as disturbing today as it was over a century and a half ago. This is the Mountain Meadow massacre. Although the tale of the Baker-Fancher Party would ultimately culminate in 100 bodies decaying under the relentless Utah sun, its prologue began decades earlier and more than 1,700 miles east in New York State. And it began not with a murder, but with the founding of a brand new religion, the religion most of us know today as Mormonism. The Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, often referred to as the Mormon Church, was founded in 1830 near Rochester, New York. Its unconventional beliefs, including the practice of polygamy, a practice where one man is married to multiple women, did not always sit well with the neighbors. As a result, the Mormons moved first to Ohio and then to Missouri, where state troopers forcibly evicted them. Seeking refuge in Illinois, they experienced further tragedy when an angry mob broke into the local jail and killed church founder Joseph Smith as he awaited trial. Following Smith's death, the new leader, Brigham Young, decided to distance the community from established centers of power. He led the Mormons to Utah, an area that was then part of Mexico. However, just 1 year later, the region became part of the United States as a result of the Mexican-American War. This transfer, understandably, made the Mormon settlers uneasy, as their past interactions with Americans had often turned violent. In 1850, the US government appointed Brigham Young as the first territorial governor, but disputes over whether church or state held ultimate authority in the area soon ignited conflict between Mormons and federal officials. President James Buchanan, determined to assert federal supremacy in Utah, declared the territory in rebellion and prepared to use force. In the summer of 1857, soldiers representing 20% of the entire American army began marching west. This mobilization sparked widespread panic throughout Utah. Many church members recalled the violence in Missouri and Illinois, understanding that being American citizens or living in a nation founded on religious freedom meant little when the army might annihilate them at any moment. This was the very situation facing the Baker-Fancher wagon train, a situation that, as everyone would soon discover, was about to turn deadly. As Utah prepared for war, Church President Brigham Young issued a series of defensive orders for the territory. First, he reactivated the Nauvoo Legion, a militia group charged with protecting Mormon settlements. He then held a meeting with local Native American tribes and informed them that all wagon trains were now fair game for raiding. Most notably for the Baker-Fancher Party, he ordered all Mormon settlers to stockpile food for themselves and their livestock, preparing the territory for the inevitable supply chain disruptions that accompany war. After refueling in Salt Lake City, the Baker-Fancher Party set out south. In an era before every town had a Walmart, wagon trains depended on a few western towns and forts to purchase food and supplies along the way. However, following Brigham Young's stockpile order, no one was willing to sell.
Anyone who has worked in retail can attest that most customers are genuinely pleasant. When an item is out of stock, they typically understand and they move on with their day. However, a few memorable individuals resort to yelling out of frustration. This dynamic was absolutely no different back in the 1800s. Back then, most of the confrontations resulted in gendered insults directed at women who managed household provisions. One account from a Mormon settler recalls a disappointed traveler exclaiming, quote, "The government had sent troops to kill every G-damned Mormon in Utah and that they should like to help them do the job," end quote. Meanwhile, near Fillmore, Utah, cows began to die from a mysterious ailment. A 14-year-old boy was skinning one of the dead cattle when he accidentally scratched an open sore on his nose. Within hours, his face swelled to the point that he was nearly unrecognizable. Modern scientific analysis shows that both the cattle and the boy, who later died, suffered from naturally occurring anthrax. However, no one in 1857 could have known this, as anthrax bacteria had not yet been discovered. Instead, the Mormon settlers assumed a logical conclusion based on their knowledge at the time. Someone had poisoned their spring. As anxiety spread throughout Utah, news of the Baker Fanch party quickly reached the town of Cedar City. Rumors about their unsavory behavior, likely grossly exaggerated, angered local townspeople. Unfounded accusations that the party had poisoned the spring only worsened the situation. Yet one rumor turned out to be true. The Baker Fanch party was traveling with a significant number of valuable cattle prized by the settlers of southern Utah. Summer drew to a close. Isaac Haight, the state president for Cedar City, called a meeting to discuss preparations for the coming war. Among those attending were William Dane, the local commander of the Nauvoo Legion, and John D. Lee, an Indian agent and prominent community member. The meeting eventually devolved into a heated discussion about how to handle the strangers camping nearby. Although the details of what was said remain unknown, this gathering set off a terrible chain of events that ultimately claimed the lives of approximately 100 people. On September 7th, 1857, the Baker Fanch party was grazing their cattle at a well-known rest site called Mountain Meadows when the Nauvoo Legion launched an attack. They were joined by Paiute warriors, a nearby tribe that resented American settlers encroaching on their land. The militia had enlisted these warriors in order to disguise the assault as an Indian attack. The first round of bullets went off just as the wagon train settled in for breakfast. Several members of the surprised Baker Fanch party fell to the ground, dead. Their only crime was associating with a few foul-mouthed travelers and possessing too much valuable cargo. The Mormon attempt to disguise themselves as attacking Indians was successful, and the Baker Fanch party responded by circling their wagons into a defensive position, keeping the women and children safely in the closely guarded center. As the first victims were buried within the enclosure, the men prepared their guns for a counterattack. If the Nauvoo Legion had hoped for an easy victory, they didn't get it. 5 days later, the Baker Fanch party was still hiding behind their circling wagons, firing at anyone who dared to approach. Meanwhile, the Paiutes, having suffered casualties, wanted to give up and return home. This would have been disastrous for the Nauvoo Legion, who knew that if the US military discovered the true masterminds behind the attack, there would be even more reason to target Mormon settlers. Before long, it no longer mattered whether the Paiutes had left. Other divisions of the Nauvoo Legion had joined the attack, and Major John Higbee was now commanding a substantial force of militia. It was unlikely that the wagon train hadn't caught glimpses of who their attackers truly were. 5 days of siege provided ample opportunity for mistakes, and the only way to succeed now was to leave no witnesses behind. On September the 11th, a militiaman approached the Baker Fanch party under a white flag, possibly Indian agent John D. Lee. He began by stating the truth. He was part of the local Mormon community, which had struck a deal with the Paiutes. He then informed the party that if they agreed to leave their cattle and possessions behind, they would be safely escorted back to Cedar City. The Baker Fanch party, low on water and ammunition, decided to trust him, a choice that would soon prove to be the worst and ultimately the last decision of their lives. Slowly, the travelers emerged from the protective circle of their encircled wagons. First to step forward was a wagon carrying the wounded small children and their mothers. Next came the women and children, walking behind, with the men, each accompanied by a member of the Nauvoo Legion, following last. The party must have believed that their suffering was nearing its end. Their agreements, after all, seemed perfectly logical. The attackers would claim the wagons, cattle, and baggage, but no lives would be lost. After all, what more could the enemy want? Well, none of them could have foreseen the horrors that lay ahead. As the group made its way towards Cedar City, they spread out along the trail, lined with dense sagebrush. In the vast, quiet desert, the sound of roughly 100 anxious voices must have seemed nearly deafening. Then, at a signal, every Mormon raised their gun and shot the man standing next to them. In an instant, all the men of the Baker Fancher party were dead. More militia members emerged from the sagebrush intent on killing the women and children. First they used bullets. Then, when they ran out of ammunition, they beat their victims to death with the butts of their guns. Many in the party tried to run, but none were able to get far. Others begged for their lives, though their pleas were futile. The only survivors of the massacre were 17 children, the oldest of whom was 7 years old. Mormons believe that children under the age of 8 have not yet learned to distinguish good from evil and are therefore free of sin. The militia also assumed that the young children would be unable to remember the massacre, and even if they did, they could simply be told that they were mistaken. It was almost the perfect crime. When the relatives of the Baker Fancher party received no word from them, they pressured the US military to launch an investigation. However, that wouldn't be possible for several years. Utah was still regarded as being in rebellion, and an army was marching across the country to bring it to heel. To fully understand the outcome of what later became known as the Utah War, it's really important to recognize that Salt Lake City is almost completely encircled by mountains. As the army soon discovered, prime skiing areas are a logistical nightmare for moving troops. In fact, the Utah War never saw a single battle, even though the Nauvoo Legion was prepared to defend the city from its heavily fortified mountain passes. Ultimately, the US Army was turned back by snow. It wasn't long before an embarrassed President Buchanan proposed a deal. If Brigham Young would step down as governor, everyone could receive a pardon and move on with their lives as though the failed invasion had never occurred. The Mormons accepted the terms, and the brief Utah War came to an end. Now, at this point, the Army could focus on other endeavors. In early 1859, U.S. Army Major James Carleton arrived at Mountain Meadows to investigate. He discovered bits of clothing and strands of women's hair tangled in the sagebrush, a clear sign that the victims had been left where they fell, unburied and later scavenged by animals. The bones, bleached white after more than a year in the desert sun, were gathered and reburied under a stone cairn. Once he'd fulfilled his duty to the dead, Carleton began speaking with local residents. Almost immediately, he noticed inconsistencies in the official account. For instance, the Powhats consistently denied their involvement in the massacre. In addition, the Baker Fancher party's cattle, originally branded by their previous owners, were now integrated into the Mormon herd. And then there were the matter of the children. The inhabitants of Cedar City claimed they had rescued the children from the Powhats and had willingly taken them in. However, older children remembered the massacre. They recounted having seen some of their murdered families' possessions among the Mormon settlers, even though they were reportedly told that their parents had been killed by Indians. The army located the children and removed them from their adopted families in Cedar City, where they'd been neglected. Carleton reported that some Mormons had asked to be reimbursed for the costs of caring for them over the past 2 years, but he coldly denied the request. The massacre survivors were eventually sent back to Arkansas to live with extended family. Eastern newspapers picked up the Army's investigative report, and it soon became clear who was truly responsible for the Mountain Meadow massacre. The original terms of peace were amended to state that everyone could receive a pardon except those who had murdered the Baker Fancher party. It would be years, however, before anyone came forward with evidence of those responsible. Brigham Young had conducted his own investigation immediately after the massacre, and thus claimed to know better than anyone who was involved. Yet he had already publicly declared that the Powhats were responsible and was unwilling to amend that statement. Meanwhile, the participants maintained a vow of silence, believing that if nobody talked, everyone could get away with what had occurred. But as the old saying goes, two can keep a secret only if one of them is dead. In 1870, Philip Klingensmith, a former Cedar City bishop, came forward with a confession. The guilt of beating innocent women and children to death had eaten away at him over the years, ultimately leading him to leave the Mormon faith and move to Nevada, a place far removed from his old life. The Mormon Church fought back, blocking any attempts to arrest those responsible for the Mountain Meadow massacre. In an effort to calm a growing national anger, several figures were excommunicated, including Isaac Hite, the state president for Cedar City. So was Major John Higbee, who'd led the original attack on the wagon train. But with cover-up having persisted for over 10 years, the Mormon Church refused to let U.S. justice prevail within their territory. In 1876, Utah got a new attorney general. Sumner Howard was determined to secure a conviction for the murders, and he was willing to work with Brigham Young to achieve it. Together, they decided that someone had to take the blame, and that person was Indian agent John D. Lee. At his 1876 trial, the prosecution called witness after witness to testify about Lee's involvement. According to their version of events, Lee was the one who approached the Pirates about a joint attack, the one who decided that everyone needed to be eliminated, and the one who had approached the party under a white flag, convincing them to leave the safety of their wagons. Lee had shot women and children during the massacre, showing no remorse. It was all on him. On September 20th, 1876, the all-Mormon jury returned their verdict: guilty. John D. Lee was sentenced to death for the murder of the Baker Fancher Party. In 1800s Mormonism, there existed a doctrine known as blood atonement. This teaching held that for certain unspeakably horrible crimes, the only path to forgiveness was for the sinner's own blood to be shed as sacrifice for their eternal soul. While most Mormons saw this as more of a metaphor, the heinous nature of the Mountain Meadow massacre led church leaders to adopt a literal interpretation. On March 23, 1877, John D. Lee returned to the grassy meadow near Cedar City, the very site where roughly 100 people had once perished at the hands of the Nauvoo Legion. Accompanying him were a minister, several federal officials, a firing squad, and a coffin. When asked if he had any final words, Lee replied, "A victim must be had, and I am the victim." He then climbed into the coffin as the firing squad took aim at his heart. His blood was absorbed by the same ground that had soaked up the blood of the Baker Fancher Party 2 decades earlier, a symbolic offering of justice to an all-knowing God. At first glance, it may seem that the Nauvoo Legion committed the perfect crime. After all, only one person was ever held accountable for the massacre, and even today, a complete list of those responsible remains elusive. We will likely never know all those involved in the murder of the Baker Fancher Party. However, the goal of the Mountain Meadow massacre was not simply to escape punishment. It was to ensure that no one would ever uncover the truth. The purpose behind killing them was twofold. Not only did it aim to avoid repercussions in the criminal justice system, but it also sought to distance the Mormon Church from any association with such a heinous act. As this video demonstrates, they failed miserably in achieving that objective.